Okay, now that we've configured identity, we now have two entities in our domain project, the activity and the app user entity. Now, what we're going to look at now is configuring the relationship between the activity and our users. Now, our activity can have many users as an attendee, and our users can attend many activities. So what we have here is a many-to-many relationship. Now, in the past, .NET Core has not been able to do anything with many-to-many relationships by convention, so we would always have to manually configure this ourselves. And we are still going to manually configure this ourselves, but I do want to briefly demonstrate what we can do by convention in .NET Core or .NET 5, and then I'm going to say why we're not going to use it on this occasion, but it won't take long to demonstrate. So what we'll do is we'll just use convention to get Entity Framework to create the relationship between these two entities. And the way that we do this, inside our activity entity, we'll add a property that's going to be an iCollection of type app user, and we'll call it attendees. And we'll bring in iCollection from system collections generic. And the other side of the relationship in the app user, what we'll do is we'll add an iCollection of type activity, and we'll call it activities. And we'll also bring in system collections generic. And what we'll do, we'll just go into our terminal, and we'll need to restart or stop our API, I should say. So do make sure this is stopped. It is a required step. And we'll CD up to the solution level. And then what we'll do is we'll create a new migration. So we'll say .NET EF migrations, add, and we'll say activity attendee. And we'll specify -p and persistence, and we'll specify -s and API as the startup project, and press return. And this should go ahead and create a new migration without any issues. And let's take a look at what we got from doing this. If we go into persistence and migrations and take a look at the new migration that was created, we can take a look and see what Entity Framework by convention has done for us here. So it's going to create a physical table in our database called Activity App User. And conventionally, when you create a join table, which is what this is, then you'll specify the name of the two entities as the name of the join table. And then we have just two columns, the activities ID and the attendees ID. And this is enough for our relationship between these two entities. And we also get a primary key created that's a combination of both the activities ID and the attendees ID, which is great. But we're not going to use this because what we can't do by convention is add another property in our join table. For instance, I would like to know if this attendee is also the host of this activity. And we do not have the ability to do that by using conventions in this way. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll actually remove this migration. And because we haven't committed this to the database, there is no problem with just doing this in the command line. So what we'll do is we'll just remove the name of the migration, and we'll use the .NET EF migrations remove command. We'll keep the switches and press return. And this works no problem. So if we're not going to use conventions to do this, how are we going to do this? Well, what we're going to do is create a join table. And to do that, we're going to create a new entity in our domain. So we'll say new C# class, and we'll call this activity attendee. And then what we can do inside this particular class is we can specify the properties. So we're going to have a string of the app user ID, and then we'll specify app user, and we'll just call it app user. We'll have a GUID that's going to represent the activity ID, and we'll need to bring in a system to make use of the GUID here. And then we'll say prop activity and call it activity. And then what we can do is add any properties that we want to get access to as part of this kind of join table. And like I mentioned, I would like to know if this particular attendee is the host of the activity as well. So we'll just add a boolean in here called isHost. And what we do then is we go back to our activity entity, and instead of specifying app user, we specify the join entity here. So this is going to be activity attendee, and in our app user, it's going to be exactly the same. So activity attendee, and we'll keep the names. We'll call this one activities, and in our activity, we'll call this attendees. Now, what we do need to do is give this some configuration in our data context, because we're not using conventions this time. We've just added these two tables inside here, and we want to go and give this some additional configuration. So we'll open up the data context, and we'll do two things here. First of all, we're going to add another DB set. And even though there's absolutely no problem with using the activity entity to add a new attendee, for example, if we want to query this table directly in our code, then we do need to have a DB set. So there will be an occasion where we just want to get an attendee without needing to get the activity object as well. So what we'll do is we'll add a DB set, and we'll say activity attendee, and we'll call the table activity attendees. And what we also need to do is override the onModel creating method from our identity DB context. And in this particular method, we can add additional configurations. So what we'll do is we'll say protected, and then we'll say override, and then we'll say void and onModel creating, and VS Code has kindly recognized that we want to override this particular method. So I'm going to accept this, press return to let this scaffold the method. So what we get access to here is a model builder class that's got a name of builder, and then we pass this builder into the base onModel creating class. And below this, what we can do is we'll now have access to our entity configuration. So what we can do is specify builder and then entity, and we want to configure our activity attendee entity. And what we want to do first of all is tell it about its primary key. We have two properties in our activity attendee class that have ID, but we want to make up a primary key that's a combination of both the app user ID and the activity ID. So what we'll do is we'll say x goes to x.hasKey, and in here we'll specify AA, and then we'll specify new, and we'll put this inside an object, and we'll say AA.appUserID, AA.activityID. And this is going to form the primary key in our table. What we'll do then is we'll configure the entity itself. So we'll say builder, and then we'll say entity again, and we'll say activity attendee. And what we're going to do here is specify that this has one, and we'll say u goes to u.appUser, and we'll say with many, a goes to a.activities, and then we'll say has foreign key, and we'll specify the foreign key of the app user table. So we'll say AA goes to AA.appUserID as the foreign key. And we need to do the other side of this relationship as well. So I'm just going to copy this and paste it below. And instead of app user, this is going to be activity. And instead of activities, this is going to be attendees. And the foreign key is going to be the activity ID in this case. So this is our configuration for our many-to-many relationship. And what we can do now is head back to our terminal, and we'll just go ahead and repeat the migrations command that we used earlier. And this should be successful. And if we go take a look at our migrations and take a look at the migration that's just been created, what we'll find is that what we've got is very similar to what Entity Framework would have created for us had we not needed this extra property. So it's pretty much the same thing, except for we have isHost inside this table as well. And we've got all of the other constraints that were added that we looked at earlier, including our primary key that we added there, along with the foreign keys. Perfect. So now we have this migration in place. What we need to look at next is how we can add attendees to our activities using this new join table.